Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar, Trapped During a Pandemic, the Fight for Freedom from Immigration Detention. There are a lot of people on today's call and all are currently muted, but we want your questions at the end. So please type your questions in the chat box, which is in the bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. As I said, my name is Mary Meg McCarthy, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Immigrant Justice Center, and we are honored to have all of you with us today and to have this stellar panel to talk about the fear and the crisis that is occurring in the immigration detention centers as a result of this pandemic. Let me tell you briefly about the National Immigrant Justice Center. We're more than 30 years old, a human rights organization dedicated to process and human rights protections for immigrants and refugees. We work in 5 cities with a staff of 125 individuals, extremely committed and extremely experienced in advocating for the rights of immigrants. We also are very fortunate to work with over 2,000 pro bono attorneys, one you will hear from today from the law firm of Sidley and Austin. NIJC is unique in that we draw on our direct legal services to more than 13,000 immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers and their families to advance systemic reform. It is these cases, the experiences of our clients facing detention and removal from the U.S. that informs our advocacy and our priorities. We engage in strategic litigation. We engage in advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels and public education. We decided to host this program during this pandemic with 3 objectives in mind. 1, to address the heightened danger that detained immigrants face. 2, to identify NIJC's efforts to secure their freedom and uphold their due process rights. And 3, to enlist you in our efforts to fight for the rights of the impacted community. We will be providing you with the facts of what is happening, the skills and experience necessary to free immigrants from detention are always an important bulwark of human rights. But in this situation today, we are literally saving lives. I'm now going to turn this over to Heidi Altman, NIJC's Director of Policy, who works out of our DC office. Heidi?
Thank you so much, Mary Meg. And I want to start by saying how heartwarming it has been for us to see how many people are showing up for this and other webinars, and how much we appreciate you taking time out of what we know is a really hectic and difficult time for everyone to pitch in and learn about what's going on during this difficult time. So if you're following along with the slides, I'm going to zoom us out for a moment and contextualize what we're talking about and focusing on today, right? Which is people trapped behind bars in perhaps the most frightening place you could be during an international pandemic. And I want to contextualize that in this moment in time, the past 3 years, and the ways that we have seen this administration repeatedly attack, criminalize, and dehumanize immigrant communities. Today, we're seeing the administration do what we unfortunately and tragically have seen it do from day one, which is to preference anti-immigrant policies over human rights, over civil rights, over compassion, and in this case especially over common sense and over the greater public good, which I think many of us find particularly shocking. I want to talk about quickly as a broader frame 3 ways in which we're seeing immigrant communities especially and disparately harmed during this pandemic, which is so heartbreaking, especially as many of NIJC clients and their families and immigrant communities are among the frontliners providing healthcare, grocery workers, etc. So first, we're seeing that immigrant communities are excluded from the protections, whether it's cash benefits or access to free testing and care that Congress is providing through the stimulus packages. Second, we see the border no longer an exaggeration to say literally shut down and sealed to asylum seekers and unaccompanied children through the issuance of the Center for Disease Control and Protection's border closure order, which remains in place and which has led to what the administration calls the expulsion of thousands of asylum seekers. This is truly an extraordinary, maybe unprecedented exercise of executive power that stands in violation of international and domestic law, and that has literally, as you'll see in the slide, no justification or basis in public health rationale. And then, of course, to close the circle, what we're talking about today is this third point, which is ICE persistent and continued enforcement of civil immigration laws and persistent detention, despite the overwhelming recommendations of public health experts to the contrary. And that's where our focus is today. So if we can bring it to the next slide, we have a couple snapshots in time on this slide here. One is that for those of you who follow NIJC's public-facing advocacy work, we have for some time now been publicly calling for an end to the use of incarceration and secure detention for civil immigration enforcement. And that's because we believe that the reliance on incarceration is entirely inappropriate in the context of civil migration management, and that we've seen over the course of the immigration detention largely driven by the for-profit industry, which leads to perverse incentives and all kinds of cost-cutting measures. So that brings us to today, when we are continuing, not anew, but continuing our call for the release of immigrants who are trapped during this pandemic in immigration detention. And now we are joined in those calls by public health experts, correctional health experts, former ICE and DHS officials, all calling loudly for ICE to suspend or at least severely restrict civil immigration enforcement and to release immigrants who are stuck inside immigration detention. We have seen some small movement by ICE in response to these calls, but I want to emphasize that it has been small and that it is very easy to mistake the numbers that ICE is presenting for much more progress than we've actually seen. So what we believe today is that, as across the country, we're hearing calls for decarceration of the federal prisons, state and county and local jails, in addition to immigration secure detention. We believe that ICE has agreed to release about 700 people because of COVID-19. That's about 2% of all of the people in immigration jails nationally. ICE contracts with prisons and county jails in about more than 200 facilities nationally. ICE has also noted, and you will read in the press, many of you probably have, that its detention numbers generally are significantly down. And for those of us who have been working and fighting for decarceration in the immigration space and elsewhere for years, it's a very cruel irony that is in fact the case. But the reason for that decrease in numbers is not because of a responsible response to the pandemic by ICE, but rather because of the border closure, which has effectively sealed the southern border, meaning that there are very few, if any, asylum seekers actually coming into the system. So the numbers are down because the US is not allowing asylum seekers to seek protection here, not because they are engaging in responsible actions for public health through releases. It's very difficult to overstate the danger and the fear of those who remain inside immigration detention. And I'm not going to go into it because you're going to hear in a moment from one of our clients and from Dave and from Michaela a much more personal recounting of what it is like for those who are stuck. But I do want to share that just today, researchers at Brown University and numerous other universities and research institutes published a report presenting the findings of a modeling project that demonstrate the likely spread of COVID-19 in immigration detention. This report found that under the most optimistic scenario, 72% of the approximately 30,000 people in immigration detention nationally will be infected by COVID-19 within 90 days. That's 72%, nearly 3/4 of all of the 30,000 people currently behind bars and ICE facilities. There's also very alarming findings in this report regarding how quickly that will overwhelm local hospitals and ICUs, which brings us back to the point I began on, which is that the administration's persistence in engaging in anti-immigrant policies is putting not only those who are behind bars at risk, but all of our surrounding communities. You know, I'm gonna move us on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what NIJC is doing. We root our advocacy work on this issue in the fact that this is solvable. This is a solvable problem. ICE has complete discretion over who it detains, over its enforcement actions, and over for how long it keeps people in detention. And so it's amazing to see op-eds by, for example, a former director of ICE reminding the administration that ICE does have full discretion to release everyone in its custody right now into alternatives to detention, community-based care, and their homes and their families where they can shelter in place. And so we have been engaging in federal advocacy on that front. We have a number of priorities that we are sharing with congressional offices through Zoom and online and telephonic meetings that extend to all of the protections that I began talking about, exclusions, working to remedy exclusions of immigrant communities from the stimulus packages so that financial and healthcare related stimulus benefits are available for all, so that those facing expiration authorizations can have them automatically extended. And then for many of the restrictions that we're talking about today that are so necessary on detention and enforcement, calling for mandatory releases in the next stimulus package, and calling for members and possibly can with the administration to do what public health experts are telling them to do, asking members of Congress to write letters, to engage in efforts both at the federal level and with their local field office directors and ICE officials. And we are working to engage in this education in a way that lifts up and shares and champions the voices of our clients. And so with that, I'm going to hand this over to Ellen, who is going to play for you a quick audio recording of an NIJC client who joined us and other advocates at other organizations for a briefing we presented and hosted for congressional staffers using Zoom, where we encouraged them to undertake and champion many of the efforts that I just laid out. This client is named Marco. He was behind bars in the immigration detention system while facing immigration court proceedings for over a year in county jails that contract with ICE in Illinois. He was just released on April 2nd, and he joined this Zoom call last week to share with congressional staffers as they were thinking about what they should prioritize with leadership in the next stimulus package, his experience in immigration detention during a time of pandemic.
To appear before you to discuss my experiences in ICE detention during the COVID-19 pandemic. I was in Pulaski County Detention Center when the COVID-19 pandemic began and was transferred to McHenry County Adult Correctional Facility for the last month. When I'm describing our events from my time at McHenry County, I felt insecure in the jail. We were hearing things, seeing things on the news, but we didn't see the jail staff doing anything different. We would ask for things, cleaning supplies, masks, soap, hand sanitizer, and none was provided. There was about 64 people in the unit, and there was no soap, no hand sanitizer, or anything. You had to ask, and all they will give you was this tiny little bar. They were running low on everything. There's no way you can have social distance from everyone. You're in a tiny, tiny cell with another person. You have to be in front of 3 or 4 more people at least, and there's just not enough chairs for everybody to sit.
Okay. Dave?
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone again for being with us this afternoon. My name is Dave Faraday, and I'm a staff attorney at NIJC's Detention Project. I'm just going to talk briefly about our direct service efforts in the face of this COVID-19 pandemic. And if you can go to the next slide, Ellen. Our work on the detention team has, I mean, while it's been difficult to adjust to the remote work, the detained dockets in immigration court are proceeding like they were before, unlike most of the other immigration court proceedings of the non-detained nature, which have all been canceled and postponed at this time. But the detained dockets have continued despite this pandemic. That being said, it's been much more difficult to proceed with these hearings. All of the hearings now are done via video conference with the clients, with the detainees, and then the attorneys will be calling in on the telephone. And so while it's good that we have that ability to continue participating in these hearings, it's become very difficult to actually proceed with these hearings in some cases. Also, our in-person presentations have come to a standstill. We used to do many Know Your Rights presentations where we would go into the detention centers in the Chicago area to do presentations for detainees. We can only represent a small fraction of those who are in immigration detention. And so many people proceed in their hearings without an attorney. And so those presentations have been very important. And those have stopped. We do have a hotline where individuals can call in, and we've been getting a lot of calls on that hotline, and we try to follow up with as many people as we can, but those in-person presentations have stopped. We are trying to develop other ways of maybe creating videos that can be broadcast to these individuals as being there in person, but we're trying to come up with creative solutions to this problem that we're in right now. And then if you can go to the next slide, as was just said from our client in that congressional testimony, it's been incredibly difficult for clients in immigration detention. Most of the information on the pandemic is coming from the TV, is coming from the news. It's not being shared by ICE or by the individual detention centers to our clients, to the detainees. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the detention centers themselves about what is actually happening, whether quarantine or isolation practices are occurring among the detainees, among us advocates trying to figure out what the policies are. It's very unclear what's happening. And the basic hygiene supplies are missing or in very short supply. Most of the detention centers where we have clients, the detainees are responsible for most of the cleaning of their areas, and they're giving very basic cleaning supplies that sometimes don't really work. It's sort of unclear what the liquid that they're given is, whether it's actually soap, and it's also just it's impossible in virtually all of these cases for individuals to keep social distancing and to have hand washing and hand sanitizer available at all times. Just the way that these detention centers are built and operated, it's virtually impossible to do that. So that is something that's extremely unsettling for all of us. And ICE has been we have here ICE's radio silence. Has been very difficult to get anything from ICE throughout this process. And ICE, we will say too, in the middle of March, one of our biggest detention centers in Kenosha County, Wisconsin, ICE in the middle of the night transferred all of the detainees from that detention center. It was over 100 individuals, transferred them out of that detention center into the other detention centers in the Chicago area, but also a large number of the detainees went to detention centers in Texas and other states. And so this was this was in the middle of this pandemic. It was extremely dangerous, and we had no notice of it. Even some of the attorneys for ICE didn't know this was happening. So it just shows you that sort of the ICE's response to this pandemic has been very difficult to deal with. And so in the face of all of this, we have on the detention team, we have gone through all of our clients and reevaluated whether we can get them out as fast as we can. And that's something we always do even before this pandemic, but we've reevaluated in other methods that we can try to seek their release. So whether we have new bond redetermination motions in the immigration court setting, or which we've done with everyone as well, we've asked ICE directly, like Heidi was saying, ICE has the authority to release anyone at any time. So we've written strongly worded requests to ICE to release our clients, especially those who we've identified with the particular medical vulnerabilities to this pandemic. We've also had individuals, in addition to medical vulnerabilities, have just gotten sick and have had symptoms of COVID and have not been tested, but we're worried that they are in serious trouble if they have these symptoms. So unfortunately, most of our ICE release request efforts have not yielded anything from ICE. And so we've partnered with our litigation team, but also with many of our pro bono partners to submit habeas corpus petitions in federal court based on the COVID pandemic, and also based on other avenues for relief, such as prolonged detention. And so with that, it's a great segue into our next panelist, Michaela from Sidley.
Hi, I'm Michaela Cabot. I'm an associate in Sidley Austin's General Litigation Group in Chicago. So I'll be speaking about some of the ways that pro bono partners like Sidley have been collaborating with NIJC. Since late March, Sidley has been working with NIJC to request release for the detained and vulnerable clients describing. We requested the release of these clients through habeas corpus petitions, which is a mechanism to challenge whether the detention of an individual complies with the Constitution. As Dave described, NIJC had already requested ICE to take action on releasing these detainees who are all medically vulnerable, and ICE had denied the request. So this was the last means to move forward. I was involved with 3 of our petitions, so I'll just be talking about those, but these are not the only petitions that Sidley has been working on with NIJC. For our three petitions, on the Sidley side, we had 1 Sidley partner, pro bono counsel, 3 associates, and Sidley drafted most of the habeas petitions and related briefs, but we had a ton of input and
Appears that Michaela is offline, and so at this point we're going to jump to Dorian, and then hopefully Michaela will come back online, and we'll come back to Sidley's fabulous efforts with the habeas petitions and litigation. So we're going to switch now to our San Diego office, and Dorian, if you could jump in.
Hi, thank you so much everybody for being here. And even though Michaela dropped serious appreciation for all of the firms and pro bono attorneys who are working on these petitions, it's been really amazing as a staff member to see. We'll just get emails in the middle of the day saying like this person was released, and it definitely makes everything feel worth it. So my name is Dorian Edgar-Seto. I'm a senior attorney in our San Diego office. This is our NIJC's newest office and newest initiative. We have 2 permanent staff members full-time down in San Diego, housed out of the Federal Defender's Office in this very exciting cross-border collaboration. It looks like Michaela's back on. Should we go back to finish up our habeas?
Sure.
Okay.
Good work also. So yes, thank you for jumping in, Michaela. Welcome back. And then we'll circle back to Dorian, okay? Thank you.
So this is actually very apropos that just happened, because we had virtual hearings in all 3 of these cases, and that happened constantly throughout the process because nobody, including the court system, knows what they're doing, and internet connections are unreliable, which is just what happened here. But going back to the conditions at Kankakee Detention Center, And moving on to the next slide, our clients were being held at Jerome Combs Detention Center, which is in Kankakee County. It's mostly a county jail, but it also contracts with ICE to house detainees. We first started talking to our clients about the conditions that they were facing around April 1st. And it was completely consistent with what we just heard from the NIJC client testifying and what Dave just said. Our clients had been given no information regarding how to prevent the spread of COVID, or even told that that the pandemic was happening. They were learning everything from TV. There were no instructions regarding social distancing or to avoid touching their faces. There were no changes to their daily activities, in addition to obviously their living conditions, 4 of them to a very small room. There were no changes to things like lining up to eat or having to sit close together at meal times. And our clients reported that many of the detainees and some of the staff were coughing, and only a small proportion of the staff were wearing any masks and gloves. This was despite Kankakee County having one of the highest per capita infection rates in the state of Illinois. So we got declarations from our clients attesting to these conditions, and all three clients' declarations were consistent on this. Before we filed the petition, there were a few changes that were implemented at the facility, but the changes were minimal and did not change the fact that at a facility like that, if you're vulnerable to COVID, there's just simply no way to maintain space from other individuals to keep yourself safe. So each of our clients has different susceptibilities to COVID. Our first client has diabetes, asthma, and had a prior heart attack. As I'm sure everyone knows, all of these conditions are associated with both a greater chance of contracting COVID and a greater chance of experiencing serious complications or death from the virus. This client had been detained for almost a year only because he could not afford the $2,000 bond that the immigration judge had set. Our second client had a history of severe pneumonia, chronic sinus issues, and high blood pressure. High blood pressure is associated with greater susceptibility to COVID and a higher mortality rate. This client was also married to a US citizen and had 3 US citizen kids under the age of 5. He had been detained about 10 months and was actually detained when his son was born. He has a pending application to become a US citizen through his wife. And our third client came into the US as an unaccompanied immigrant child. He had been recommended to be transitioned to a supportive living environment upon turning 18, but ICE instead took him to adult detention, where he was being held for 4 months without needed mental health care. So he was at risk of serious mental health issues from being quarantined due to COVID. Moving on to the next slide, we filed all 3 of these habeas petitions the week of April 6th in the Central District of Illinois. Each of the petitions made the same general argument that our client was being held in violation of his constitutional right under the Due Process Clause to safety in government custody. We brought additional claims in each case, each slightly different, that their rights were being violated due to the unconstitutionally prolonged amount of time that they were being detained. The 3 petitions ended up being before 2 different judges, and in each, the judge ordered expedited emergency hearings within 2 days of filing. As I mentioned, the hearings were all virtual, and the highlight for me was one of the judges, I won't say which one, telling us that they were wearing one of their kids' graduation robes instead of a judge's robe. In each case, the government argued that the detention center was doing much more to prevent the spread of COVID than any of our clients had observed. But in the end, the judges sided with us, and all 3 of our clients were released that very same day. Since those releases, which were ordered on April 9th, 10th, and 13th, we've been in the midst of briefing the petitions on the merits. Actually, this weekend, Dave and I were on the phone a lot with one of our clients, getting a declaration for a brief that we're filing today. So the reason that we're still doing briefing, even though they've been released, the initial release orders from the judges were temporary restraining orders, which meant that the judge had found that it was likely that we would be able to show that there was a constitutional violation, and also that our client would suffer irreparable harm if they weren't released. But it was by its very nature temporary. So now we're requesting a more long-term release. Last week, one of our clients' habeas petitions was granted with the judge ordering his continued release through, quote, the pendency of the COVID-19 pandemic. So our hope is that by the time the government is permitted to detain him again, he will have already moved forward in his immigration case, and he won't actually be eligible for detention. So we have briefed due in 2 other cases, that case I just mentioned with Dave's client, and another case today. So hopefully we will be getting some good orders on these cases for our clients in the next few days.
That's very exciting.
Go ahead, Dana.
Yeah, so thank you again, Michaela. I don't think you heard me singing your praises before, but we really appreciate all of the federal court work. So I want to talk a little bit about what is happening in NIJC's more national facing work. So as I said before, I am based in our newest office down here in San Diego on the border. Which opened last September, but that was not the first time that we've been involved on the border. NIJC has been working with clients nationally for quite some time, not just in the Chicago area, but also across the country. And so historically, our LGBT immigrant rights initiative has had clients detained down in the San Diego area, and we have some pretty long-standing relationships with some of the organizations here. And so that has made it really, really easy and great for us to establish a more permanent presence. So if you can go to the next slide. So we operate in a bunch of different detention facilities, and I think the reason they asked me to speak last is because our work down in California really is kind of a micro illustration of how all of NIJC's different advocacy modalities come together. Our San Diego project works with people who are dually prosecuted in both the federal criminal system and the immigration system for the act of crossing the border. We work in collaboration with the federal defenders with their clients who are facing federal criminal proceedings, misdemeanors for unlawful entry into the United States just for crossing the border. And also for re-entry after a prior deportation. Both of those are federal crimes. And then we follow those clients into immigration custody once they are done with their term in U.S. Marshals custody. And so I wanted to show you all this map to kind of show you the geographic spread of where we're working, and also that our facility, I guess the diversity of facilities that we work in. And to really emphasize that, I think Heidi mentioned this before, and Dave just speaking about like local county jails, private prison facilities where immigration custody happens. Those are also facilities where many federal criminal detainees are held pre-trial, and for county jails where local jail populations are held. And so a lot of these facilities are shared. And so while there are different components of the federal government that are working and kind of maintaining detention authority over these people, it's the same facilities and everybody's breathing the same air, right? And so down here on the border, we have one detention center that only holds ICE detainees, but we have several others that hold both ICE detainees and U.S. Marshals detainees, so people who are facing pretrial federal criminal detention. And so our response to COVID-19 has really been to collaborate with people who are working across all of those different legal systems and all of those different facilities. So if you could go to the next slide. And so the really kind of big illustration of this has been at Otay Mesa Detention Center. This is our largest area detention center, and it is now, I believe, holds the very dishonorable title of being the immigration detention center with the highest number of confirmed positive COVID-19 cases in the country. Otay Mesa holds, it has space for about 1,500 detainees. A number of those are pretrial U.S. Marshals detainees, and the rest are in ICE custody. And so very, very early on, along with our allies in the area, we became very, very concerned that that Otay Mesa would become a hotspot. It holds a lot of people who are caught crossing the border right as they enter. We knew that California had an early incidence of COVID-19 in the country. Many of the people who were originally taken off of cruise ships were actually held in naval bases in our area. And so we knew that it was in San Diego, that it was in the community, that there was a very, very high likelihood that people who are working at the facility, so jail officials, would be bringing, kind of unknowingly bringing the virus into detention as they went about their daily lives in and out of our San Diego community where transmission was happening. And so, as predicted, on March 31st, the first employee at Otay Mesa Detention Center tested positive for COVID-19. Immediately, one of the housing units went onto quarantine, where that we believe that person had contact with detainees. As of April 10th, 10 detainees were found positive. April 14th, it became the largest outbreak at an immigration detention center. And I don't actually have numbers as of today, but as of Friday, there were 67 ICE detainees and 44 U.S. Marshals detainees who had tested positive at the facility, so 111 total. 17 Core Civic, that's the private prison company that runs it, employees that tested positive, and 8 medicals. And so we're seeing this impact not only our clients who are detained, but also the people who work at the facility and by extension their families, because they don't sleep there, right? They go home every day. And so that's kind of what's been happening. If you could go to the next slide. So I said earlier that our work in San Diego is really kind of a very small illustration of how all of NIJC's different advocacy priorities come together. And so Mary Meg was talking about how we do direct services work, and then that informs our policy advocacy on the Hill. It informs our impact litigation work to try to make outcomes better for our clients. And so in our San Diego work, we really take that to heart, and we do all three of those things. And so when I do an intake with a client, I'm thinking about their individual defenses, but I'm also thinking about whether or not something that's happened to them is really common across our clients' experiences and something that we should lift up by impact litigation. And then vice versa, when our policy teams and our litigation teams say, hey, we've been looking at this issue, I kind of go back to my clients and say, have you seen this? To try to really get a more holistic sense of what's happening in immigration custody and in deportation case processing, but also to really advance our clients' interests. And so we've taken this approach from before COVID and really applied it to our work here. And so we've been doing individual advocacy to get our current clients out of detention, lots of parole requests. I'm drafting some Habeas petitions today after this call. But we've also been doing a lot of collaboration with our allies. And so lifting up client stories, sending them over to Heidi in the RDC office. And really documenting what's been happening. So the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties last week filed a class action lawsuit demanding the release of everybody from Otay Mesa Detention Center and Imperial Detention Center, which are the 2 ICE facilities that we serve down here in San Diego. And as part of that filing, and because I've been speaking to my clients for the past month about what's been happening inside both of those detention centers, I was able to provide them an 8-page attorney declaration, just really laying out in excruciating detail all of the horrifying things that our clients have seen, and a lot of what David and Michaela had spoken about. So we've been contributing to those advocacy efforts by our allies, but then we've also been doing kind of what I consider to be NIJC's 4th advocacy modality, which is really publicizing what's been happening. And so as attorneys, we talk a lot about building our record, right? We want to submit all of the evidence to the judge that we need to, so that maybe they can do the right thing, but we can also appeal that decision if they don't go our way, right? when we're filing a habeas petition, we have to file a release request before we do that. We have to put it on the record that we've really tried to get the federal government to stand up and to do the right thing, and to really tell the story of what our clients are experiencing. And I think, so we think about that a lot in terms of the law, but I also really think that in this moment, it is our job and our obligation to build the record in the public. When you know, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the road, hopefully when we're thinking about what an odd time this was, we will know that we told the stories of the people who we serve, and that those people's voices were heard. And so to that end, we've been doing a lot of press. And so that screenshot that you see is actually from some local news coverage of a press conference that we organized in collaboration with the Federal Defenders of San Diego and a number of other immigrant rights organizations and a public health expert, to basically say to the press, listen, you keep on calling us and asking us for stories, so here's a chance for you to listen to what we're saying, and to really kind of be affirmative about our outreach to the press and make sure that the story that our clients are experiencing and what's happening in detention is really uplifted. And so out of that came a number of articles, and I think it really has been a testament to our clients who have been willing to speak out despite the risk of retaliation, and also to advocates around the country. And NIJC has absolutely taken a big role on this in trying to tell that story in the public so that people know what's going on.
Great. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. I will come on now. My name is Ellen Miller, and I am the pro bono manager with NIJC, assisting the various projects and pro bono teams. And again, thank you for joining us today. You've heard a lot of information now, and we want to make sure that everybody can get involved as well, because every little bit helps, right? So attached to this webinar, and it will go out in another email post the webinar, you have a one-page information sheet on what can you do. And this what can you do sheet really runs the gamut. If you're an attorney, if you're not an attorney, if you are a parent of young children, or if you're a retired individual, there are different ways to get involved. And so we encourage you to look at this sheet and to take action, and also to share it. You know, feel free to share this information. And so if you're an attorney, we have a number of cases that need representation. If you're an attorney and with other wonderful colleagues and can help us with our habeas petitions, we welcome that as well. Please get in touch. There are a number of ways to support people in immigration detention right now, in immigration jail. If you speak another language, we have a way to register and to sign up. We need pro bono volunteer interpreters, both for our staff, Burmese interpreters, Hindi, Spanish, French, a number of African languages. We can use your services, please. And if you allow us to pass your contact on to pro bonos as well. Heidi can talk a little bit about ways to get involved with advocacy or policy, contacting your members of Congress, your representatives. And also, one of our main objectives of this presentation is to make sure that everyone stays informed. So as I think everybody highlighted here today, we have a number of ways that we're trying to get the right information out, and we're trying to get up-to-date information out as quickly as possible. So our teams have worked really, really hard. Last week, we gave a presentation on Know Your Rights for the stimulus benefits for Illinois and Indiana. In 2-3 weeks, we have some more information coming out in another presentation. We have a number of resources on our website, so please check that out. And then, of course, and I'm sure Mary Meg can talk a little bit more about this as well, we appreciate your donation. If you cannot, or right now is not the time that you can support in another way, there are a number of ways where financial support and assistance can enable others to do the work and allow us to continue it as well. So I'll just say that we do have our luncheon coming up in June, and Mary Meg can speak to that in a minute. But before we get to the question and answers, I wanted to just raise as well that on May 14th, you'll see we have another one of these presentations coming up, and we've entitled it False Friction, reconciling COVID-19 and immigrant rights. And so we're right now intending to talk about the border closure, and some of the executive statements that are coming from this administration. Of course, being that it's 3 weeks away, we don't really know everything else that could happen during that time. And so we will keep you up to date. Please register for that on our website. We'll also send it in the email to come. Mary Meg, did you want to add anything else in terms of getting?
No, I think it's great, and we're so grateful that you were all able to join us and participate. And thanks to the wonderful panelists, the NIJC staff and our pro bono attorneys at Sidley have been just great partners, and so nimble and responsive at this time when you know, we've been fighting, especially the past 3 years, and this is just like a whole nother level of fight that we are engaged in to ensure and uphold fundamental basic human rights protections. Ellen mentioned we have our annual Human Rights Awards on June 2nd. Usually that's a luncheon with 1,000 people. Most likely it will be going virtual to ensure social distancing, and we'll be able to share that information with you. We'd love to have you join us. So I think we can go now to the question and answers.
Great. We have a number of questions that have come in. If you have additional questions, please feel free to type them into your chat box, your questions box there, and we'll get to them. If you don't have any questions or after the questions, we'd also appreciate if you could fill out the survey to let us know what else you want to know about or what we might have missed. There's a QR code there that you can hold up your phone to, or we'll send around the link later. Okay, so we're going to actually go back. One of our very first questions came up when Heidi, you were speaking. And you were talking about 72%, an anticipated 72% of individuals. Would you be able to just share a little bit more about, you know, a potential time period that you were referencing?
Yes, and I'm not sure if I did this correctly, but I attempted to send to everyone in response to that question. Thank you for asking it, Jen, a link to the full report that was released today. It's a report by researchers at Brown University, Brandeis, University of British Columbia, and George Mason University. So the answer to your question is that what they did is, you know, I think we've all seen the various models and projections that I think have had a very significant impact on policymaking during the pandemic, you know, whether it was the bubbles bouncing or the flattening of the curve. So they took that model and did it for immigration detention using the best data available. They looked at an optimistic scenario where ICE actually responds to some of the CDC and other recommendations, and then a pessimistic scenario. And in the most optimistic of scenarios, what they found was that within a 90-day period, from now forward, 72% of individuals who are in immigration detention would be infected with the virus. Under more pessimistic scenarios, the number got much closer to 100% of individuals. So I included a link in the chat box if you want to read the full report, and I encourage folks to do so. It's frightening.
Thanks, Heidi. While you're on, would you also just speak a little bit more about if people did want to write their members of Congress or their representatives? I think there's a couple links and resources too. For people that might watch this recording after the fact. Is there, you know, what would you say to that? You know, the chairs of the committees or local media outlets, how would you advise on that?
Yes, please, if you are at home and you have time on your hand, use it to make a call to your member of Congress, to write an op-ed, to write a letter to the editor, to engage with this issue. So the link I put in response to that question is a policy brief that we put up on our website that outlines in quite a lot of detail NIJC's policy and legislative recommendations with regard to the pandemic as it impacts immigrant communities. So if you want to get really deep in the weeds, you can pick and choose pieces from there, call your member of Congress, go to house.gov, and you can find who your congressperson is if you don't know, and just call them and say, hi, I'm calling to express my support for, you know, making sure that immigrant communities are included and covered by the next stimulus package, or making sure that there are restrictions on immigration detention and enforcement. If you're not able to go that deep in the weeds, that's okay too. NIJC is a member of the Defund Hate Coalition, which is a coalition of dozens of organizations who believe together that one of the best ways we can mitigate the harms caused to migrant communities right now during the pandemic and generally under this administration is to try to cut the detention and enforcement budgets, which have so rapidly and massively ballooned in recent years. And so if you go to our website, there's a link in the How You Can Help Word document that was distributed along with this. There's a really quick script you can follow. Just call and say, you know, there's stimulus packages coming up, but there's also the regular budget that Congress has to pass every year, and we need less money for less incarceration for immigrants.
Thanks, Heidi. So that's on a macro level, getting back to the actual detainees and our work with the detainees and the immigrants themselves. Dave and Dorian, maybe Dave can start us off and then Dorian. There's some questions about how we contact or how we get in, as attorneys can't solicit, and it's all, you know, remote contact right now. Could you just give a little bit of insight of how NIJC connects with clients initially?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why those Know Your Rights presentations that I talked about are so important. You know, we try to go as often as we can. Certain detention centers we can't go to very often, but when we go, we not only provide a lot of support to people who have to do their cases without an attorney, but we also try to do, you know, individual intakes with individuals to assess whether we can take their cases, or if we can refer them to pro bono counsel who can take their cases in immigration court as well. And so without that, we still have a hotline where individuals can call us, and our wonderful staff on the detention team, the paralegal staff mostly, will field those phone calls. It's once a week for, I think it's like a 4-hour period where we get these intake phone calls, and then they do follow-up calls with the detainees and family members to figure out, again, assessing whether we can take those cases or whether we can place them with the pro bono. So that's sort of our bread and butter of getting cases. But yeah, it's definitely, without those in-person presentations and interviews that we can do, it's incredibly difficult. I'll say too, I mean, with a lot of these detention centers, they're also working with skeletal staff to prevent the spread of this virus. But what that also means is it's becoming more difficult to schedule phone calls because they'll have less times available for attorney calls. And there's also a lot of attorneys are trying to get involved in helping our, you know, this detained population as well. So there are more calls happening because in-person, you know, attorney-client consultations are not happening anymore. So sometimes we're scheduling calls and it takes like 5 or 6 days to get a call with a client, which is incredibly frustrating and difficult. So yeah, that's part of our frustration with this.
Yeah, and I'll add, so in San Diego, we largely operate off of a referral model, and so a lot of our cases we get from federal defenders who had been working with a client previously, and because their criminal defense attorneys have marginally more systemically better access to people than we do, though not really these days. But I think especially, yeah, what Dave said, the ability to do for nonprofits to do Know Your Rights presentations, it's a huge way that people are able to contact us, but also feel like they have information. And I just wanted to note, I mean, the other way that we do get clients is by word of mouth. Our clients are not passive actors in the system, right? They're actively working to defend themselves, to try to get themselves assistance to get out of detention. People organize, they help each other out. So I have, and once you get worked as an organization or as an attorney who answers their phone, you get a number of phone calls just from people in detention looking for help. And so I've actually had to tell my clients, like, please don't hand out my direct cell phone number, because if I spend all of my time answering calls from detention, literally never going to be able to do anything in your case. And so, but we have kind of developed a system where, you know, every time I have a client who is a little bit more actively involved in making sure that everybody else in their unit is taken care of, has representation, has their questions answered, I'll make sure that they know how to get in touch with the other nonprofits that work in the area, how they can get information about their own cases. Because again, there is a lot of information circulating in detention centers by detainees. Some of it is really helpful and accurate, some of it is rumors. And so a lot of our role is to make sure that people have the information that they need to be able to effectively advocate for themselves. And people are also able to call their families and to connect with attorneys that way. So yeah, I would just add that.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, like Dave and Dorian suggested, to note that immigrants do not have a right to appointed counsel. So just to underline the question also is that, as Dorian said, these individuals are not means. They are trapped in a pandemic and detention, and they're trying to get out, and we are hoping to facilitate that connection as well, and get information to them, and then help them get connected with additional information. Some of the other questions, we'll have just time for one or two other questions online, and then we can follow up with the additional questions post webinar. I know that there's lots of advocacy questions coming out too, who to contact, what to say, and so we'd be happy to get that material out there. While we're talking about detainees though, and kind of the post-release plan, what happens to these individuals? You know, is NIJC working with other organizations to do housing, to work on housing issues afterwards, and what are some of the processes there? Dave, Dorian, or Michaela, do you want to speak to that? Dave?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the best situation is when our clients have family to go to. Obviously, that's the easiest, the most seamless way for the transition from ICE detention, which in many cases is years long, and back into their normal lives. But unfortunately, yeah, a lot of our clients are not that fortunate to have the family support system, or the family support system has changed since they've been in detention, and it's incredibly difficult. I mean, many shelters require some sort of immigration status. So for our clients who have won their immigration cases and are released with some sort of status, like a green card or something like that, it's a little bit easier for them, but others, it takes some creative advocacy to try to get people housing. Many of our clients have mental health issues, which also adds another layer of difficulty to that. So it is incredibly difficult. It also depends geographically where people are. Not all of our clients live in Chicago, so it's definitely difficult depending on where those individuals reside.
Okay. We are just about at time. I do want to say though that we do have a caller on right now though who commented that the young man who aged out of Jerome, or was sent to Jerome, he is doing well right now, and so we're very happy for everybody, you know, that the whole integral system that is supporting these clients, advocating and just keeping an eye out for these individuals. It takes a village, and so we're doing a lot, as you can see, and we will continue to do a lot, and we want to get that information out there. So thank you for the update. Thank you for attending. As I mentioned, we won't have an opportunity to answer all questions. It does seem like a lot of questions too are going towards what's going on with the executive order about closing immigration and such. So please join us on May 14th, where you will hear more specifically about that, the borders closing, and all other updates that happen between then and now. In the meantime, this will be posted online later this evening. And so thank you for joining us. And thank you to our panelists for everything that they're doing, and Mary Meg for leading our charge. I will end the webinar here. So thank you very much.